When my parents dropped me off on a cold porch with nothing but 2 trash bags of clothes, I was 12 years old and crying. They drove away because my dental braces were cutting into my father's golf budget. 18 years later, they barged into that very same estate the day after my wealthy uncle's funeral, suitcases in hand, acting like they already owned the place and expecting to inherit millions. They had no idea I was the one holding the deeds, the accounts, and the locks. Before I tell you exactly how I wiped the smug smiles off their faces and threw them out into the pouring rain, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment below, letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the moment the front door flew open. My name is Chloe. I am 30 years old, a certified public accountant, and for the past 4 days, my heart had been broken into a million pieces. Uncle Thomas was the only real father I ever had. He took me in when I was a discarded child and raised me with warmth, patience, and unwavering support. He had passed away suddenly from a massive heart attack, leaving an enormous void in my life and a sprawling $18 million estate to sort through. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside was a dark, bruised purple, and rain lashed aggressively against the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study. I was sitting at his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers, trust documents, and property deeds. I was seeking comfort in the numbers. Numbers made sense. Numbers did not leave you. Then the heavy oak front doors of the estate slammed open. The sound echoed through the grand foyer, followed immediately by the obnoxious clatter of rolling luggage wheels on the marble floors. I froze my pen, hovering over a bank statement. "Put those bags in the master suite," a woman's voice barked loud and piercing. "And be careful with the leather, the floors are soaking wet." I stood up, my pulse quickening. I walked out of the study and looked down the long hallway. Standing in the foyer were Frank and Barbara, my biological parents. I had not seen them in 18 years. My father, Frank, wore an expensive-looking trench coat, shaking the rain off his umbrella right onto the antique rug. My mother, Barbara, was already pointing her manicured finger at Martha, the estate housekeeper, who had worked for Uncle Thomas for 2 decades. Martha stood by the staircase holding a dusting cloth, looking absolutely bewildered. Martha Barbara snapped, her voice dripping with the kind of false authority people use when they want to pretend they belong. "Martha, is it? Go fetch a towel immediately. And I want a pot of hot coffee brought up to the master bedroom. Frank and I have had an exhausting flight, and we are not in the mood to wait around for service." Martha blinked, looking from Barbara to the luggage. "Excuse me, ma'am, but Mr. Thomas just passed. The house is closed to guests." "We are not guests," Frank announced loudly, stepping forward with his chest puffed out. "I am Thomas's brother. I am the next of kin, which means this is now my house. You will do exactly as my wife says, or you can consider yourself unemployed as of this very minute." The sheer audacity of it struck me like a physical blow. Uncle Thomas was barely in the ground, and these vultures had flown across the country with empty suitcases ready to pick his bones clean. They had not called when he was in the hospital. They had not attended the funeral yesterday, but the scent of millions of dollars had brought them running. Their luggage made the insult worse. These were not overnight bags brought by grieving relatives who expected to sit quietly, share memories, and leave in the morning. Frank had brought 2 hard-shell suitcases, large enough for a month. Barbara had a garment bag draped over one arm and a cosmetics case balanced on top of her rolling luggage. They had arrived prepared to move into Thomas's bedroom before anyone had even read his will. I could still see the folded condolence cards on the console table behind them, cards from neighbors and employees who had shown Thomas more respect in death than his own brother had shown him in life. For one painful second, grief rose in my throat so sharply that I had to press my tongue against the back of my teeth to keep my voice steady. Thomas had spent 18 years teaching me that dignity did not require silence. I could mourn him and protect what he built at the same time. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. "You are not firing anyone," I said. My voice was perfectly calm, but it carried the cold, sharp edge of a blade. Frank and Barbara spun around. For a brief second, they did not recognize me. I was no longer the scared, skinny 12-year-old girl in hand-me-down clothes. I was a professional woman in a tailored black suit, standing tall and unbothered. Chloe Barbara said, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down. "Well, look at you, still lurking around Thomas's house, I see. I suppose it is good you are here. You can help Martha carry our bags upstairs." I did not move. Neither did Martha. I walked slowly toward them, my heels clicking deliberately on the marble floor until I stood just 5 feet away. I looked at the parents who had deemed me too expensive to keep. The same people who had driven away in a luxury sedan while I stood crying on this exact porch. "You are not staying here," I told them, my voice steady. "You are not going up to the master suite, and you are certainly not ordering the staff around. Pick up your bags and leave." Frank let out a harsh, barking laugh. He crossed his arms, trying to look intimidating. "Listen here, little girl. I do not know what kind of fantasy you are living in, but Thomas is dead. I am his only living brother. The estate goes to me. That includes this house, the cars, the bank accounts, and the staff. You are just a charity case he felt sorry for. You have no authority here. Now get out of my way before I lose my temper." I looked at him. Really looked at him. He was older, grayer, but his eyes held the same arrogant greed that had defined my childhood. "You do not have any authority." Frank continued, stepping closer. "In fact, since you have been hovering around like a rat, you can make yourself useful. Hand over the keys to Thomas's office. I know he keeps a hidden safe behind the bookshelf. I want it opened right now. I need to secure the family assets before anyone tries to steal them." I was looking right at me when he said the word steal. The irony was suffocating. This was the man who had complained that my orthodontic work was ruining his lifestyle. I vividly remembered sitting in the back of his car at 12 years old, listening to him scream at my mother about the dentist bill. He had slammed his hand against the steering wheel, shouting that he would have to cancel his country club golf trip because of my teeth. 2 days later, they packed my clothes into black plastic garbage bags. They told me we were going to visit Uncle Thomas. When we arrived, Frank dragged the bags to the door, rang the bell, and told me to wait. He jogged back to the car and they sped off before Uncle Thomas even opened the door. Now, 18 years later, he was standing in the home of the man who had actually raised me, demanding access to a safe he had absolutely no right to touch. "There is no way you are getting into that office," I said calmly, "and there is no way you are touching a single dime of his money." Barbara stepped forward, her face turning a mottled, ugly shade of red. "How dare you speak to your father that way? We are the next of kin. We have legal rights. You are nothing but a spoiled brat who brainwashed a lonely old man. If you do not give Frank the keys right now, we will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing and theft." "Call them," I challenged, crossing my arms. "I would love for the police to come." Frank pulled out his cell phone, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You think I will not do it. You think I will not have you thrown out into the street. You have always been a nuisance, Chloe, always in the way. I should have known you would try to steal what belongs to me." He began dialing. Martha, the housekeeper, took a frightened step backward, but I held up my hand to reassure her. I did not panic. As a certified public accountant who managed high-net-worth estates, I had anticipated exactly this kind of circus. Uncle Thomas and I had prepared for every possible contingency. He knew his brother better than anyone, and he knew that the moment he died, Frank would arrive to stake a claim. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. While Frank was pressing the buttons on his phone, I pulled out a thick folded document printed on heavy legal paper. It bore the official blue stamp of the county court. "Before you waste the dispatcher's time," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room, "I suggest you read this." I held the document out. Frank stopped dialing, his eyes darting suspiciously to the paper. He snatched it from my hand, snapping it open. Barbara leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the dense legal text. "That," I explained slowly and clearly, "is a legally binding property management injunction, signed by a judge yesterday morning. It grants me exclusive, immediate, and total control over this physical property, the grounds and all assets within it, pending the execution of the estate." Frank stared at the paper, his mouth working silently as he read the judge's signature. The color began to drain from his face, but his anger quickly replaced it. He crumpled the edge of the document in his fist. "This means nothing," Frank spat, though his voice lacked its previous volume. "This is just temporary paperwork. It does not change the fact that I am the sole surviving brother. The inheritance defaults to me. It means," I corrected sharply, stepping right into his personal space, "that you are legally trespassing. It means that if you do not take your hands off my property, take your suitcases off my floor, and walk out that door in the next 30 seconds, I will be the one calling the police. And I will have you both arrested for criminal trespassing and attempted burglary." Barbara gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. "You cannot do this. We are your parents. You cannot throw us out into the rain." I looked past her out the window where the storm was raging, lightning flashing across the dark sky. "You threw me out," I reminded them, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You threw me away like garbage because I was an inconvenience. You stopped being my parents the day you left me on this very porch." Frank's face turned purple. He threw the document onto the floor. "You think you have won because of some temporary court order. You think you are so smart. Just wait until the will reading on Friday. The lawyers will throw this garbage out. The estate will revert to the next of kin. And when I have the power, I am going to make sure you do not get a single penny. I will leave you with nothing." I looked at the crumpled paper on the floor, then back at them. "We will see about that. Now get out." They realized I was not bluffing. With furious, jerky movements, Frank grabbed the handles of their suitcases. Barbara shot me a look of pure venom, her mouth twisted in hatred. They dragged their bags toward the heavy oak doors, struggling to open them against the howling wind. The rain blew sideways into the grand foyer, soaking their expensive coats instantly. "We will destroy you at the lawyer's office," Frank yelled over the sound of the thunder. "Enjoy your last few days playing house little girl." I stepped forward and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the door. I did not say another word. I simply slammed the door shut in their faces, locking the deadbolt with a solid, satisfying click. The sudden silence in the foyer was profound. Only the muffled sound of the storm outside remained. I turned around to see Martha standing by the staircase. She let out a long breath and offered me a small, proud smile. I bent down, picked up the legal document, smoothed out the wrinkles, and walked back into the study. The war had officially begun, but they had absolutely no idea what was coming at the will reading. The brass elevator doors chimed open on the 50th floor of the Stanton and Hayes law firm, spilling my older brother Josh and his wife Brittany directly into the quiet waiting room where I was sitting. 3 days had passed since the incident at the estate, and my parents had apparently summoned their golden child for backup. Josh marched across the plush carpet wearing a cheap suit he probably thought looked expensive, while Brittany clutched a designer handbag that I knew for a fact was a knockoff. They did not even bother to lower their voices. Frank and Barbara stepped out of the elevator right behind them. My mother was wearing a black dress that looked more suitable for a cocktail party than a legal proceeding, and my father was already loudly discussing real estate values. "We should list the main house by the end of the month," Frank was saying, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "The market is hot right now. We can clear at least $10 million on the property alone, and then we will liquidate the cars. Thomas had that vintage Porsche in the garage. Josh, I will let you handle the sale of the vehicles. You can keep 10% of the car money for your trouble." Josh laughed loudly, slapping our father on the back. "Sounds good to me, Dad. Brittany wants to look at a summer place down in Florida, so this inheritance is coming at the perfect time. We are thinking Boca Raton." "Right, babe." Brittany nodded vigorously, adjusting her tight skirt. "Absolutely. And we need to make sure we get those antique vases from the living room before the estate sale companies come in and try to lowball us." I saw similar ones on an auction site going for $50,000 apiece. They were standing less than 10 feet away from me, talking about pawning off my uncle's life like they were at a garage sale. I remained seated in a high-backed leather chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap, watching them divide up a pie they had not even seen yet. I listened without interrupting, because every boast told me something useful. Frank spoke as if the property were already titled in his name. Josh spoke as if the cars were inventory. Brittany treated family heirlooms like items waiting for an auction listing. None of them mentioned Thomas's funeral, the years they had ignored him, or the fact that he had been a person before he became a number on a balance sheet. Their confidence was so complete that it almost calmed me. People who believe victory is guaranteed rarely notice how much they reveal before the first document is opened. I kept my briefcase closed at my feet and let them talk. Josh finally turned his head and locked eyes with me. He stopped laughing. The smug, arrogant expression he had worn since childhood settled onto his face. He whispered something to Brittany, and the two of them walked over to where I was sitting. Frank and Barbara hung back near the reception desk, watching with folded arms. "Hello, Chloe," Josh said, looking down his nose at me. "Mom and Dad told me about your little stunt at the house on Tuesday. That was real cute, pulling a temporary court order on them. But playtime is over now. The real adults are here to handle the business." I looked up at him calmly. "Uncle Thomas just died, Josh. You have not spoken to him in 15 years, and now you are here picking out summer homes in Florida with money that does not belong to you." Brittany scoffed, rolling her eyes and leaning heavily on one leg. Listen to her, Josh. She sounds just like a jealous little employee. You need to remind your sister of her place in this family. Josh leaned down, placing both of his hands on the armrests of my chair, trying to physically box me in and intimidate me. Let us get something straight right now, Chloe. You are a glorified secretary who managed his taxes. That is it. I am the oldest son of his only brother. This entire family dynasty falls to me and Dad today. So here is what is going to happen. Before we walk into that conference room, you are going to open your briefcase and hand over every single financial ledger, bank statement, and tax return you have been hoarding. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I held his gaze perfectly still. I am not giving you anything, Josh. His face flushed pink. You are going to give us the books right now, he demanded, raising his voice so it echoed across the quiet waiting room. My parents told me you have been acting extremely shady, locking them out of the house and refusing to show anyone the accounts. As the future executors of this estate, we have a legal right to audit your work. For all we know, you have been embezzling money from a sick old man for the last 5 years, and you are just trying to cover your tracks. Brittany pointed a sharp, manicured nail at my face. Exactly. We know you are an accountant. We know how easily people like you can fudge the numbers and drain accounts. If you do not hand over the ledgers right now, we are going to tell the lawyer to freeze all your personal accounts, pending a full fraud investigation. We will ruin you. I stood up slowly. I made sure to rise smoothly, forcing Josh to take a hurried step backward to avoid being hit by my shoulder. I picked up my leather briefcase and held it by my side. If you want an audit, I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady, you are more than welcome to hire a forensic accounting firm with your own money. But until a judge orders me to surrender these files, you are not touching a single piece of paper. And if you ever step into my personal space again, Josh, I will have you removed for assault. Josh opened his mouth to shout something back, but the heavy oak doors to the inner offices swung open. Richard Stanton, a tall, imposing man in a pristine charcoal suit, stepped into the waiting room. He held a thick file folder under his arm. The Davies family. Richard announced, his deep voice instantly silencing the room. We are ready for you in the main conference room. Please follow me. Frank immediately pushed past his own son, eager to be the first one through the doors. He strutted down the hallway with his chest out, Barbara trailing closely behind him, clutching his arm as if they were walking down a red carpet. Josh shot me one final venomous glare before grabbing Brittany by the hand and hurrying after them. I walked in last, taking my time, letting the heavy doors close softly behind me. The conference room was massive, dominated by a long cherrywood table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city skyline. Frank marched straight to the head of the table and pulled out the largest chair. He sat down heavily, spreading his arms across the polished wood, staking his claim. Barbara sat to his right, and Josh and Brittany took the seats next to her. They all looked at Richard Stanton with eager, hungry expressions. I walked to the opposite end of the room and took a seat near the door, placing my briefcase quietly on the floor. Richard Stanton walked to the opposite head of the table, remaining standing. He adjusted his glasses, opened the thick file folder, and looked at the group of people sitting before him. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The sound of rain hitting the glass windows was the only noise. Let us begin, Richard said in a formal, practiced tone. We are here today to read the last will and testament of Thomas Arthur Davies. I served as his primary legal counsel for the last 2 decades, and I can assure you all that this document was drafted, meticulously signed, under sound mind, and fully notarized. Get on with it, Frank interrupted, waving his hand impatiently. We all know how this works. I am his brother. Just skip to the part where you transfer the assets to my name so I can sign whatever needs to be signed. We have a busy afternoon ahead of us. Richard Stanton did not even blink. He looked at Frank with a completely blank expression. He looked down at the paper. I will read the document exactly as it is written, Richard stated firmly. Clause 1 dictates that all outstanding debts and funeral expenses are to be paid immediately from the primary checking account. Clause 2 dictates that a sum of $50,000 is to be given to his longtime housekeeper, Martha, for her years of loyal service. Barbara let out a sharp scoff. $50,000 for a maid. That is absolutely ridiculous. We are contesting that immediately. Frank, write that down. We are not giving $50,000 to the help. Richard ignored her outburst entirely. He turned the page. Clause 3 concerns the charitable donations. A sum of $100,000 is to be given to the local animal rescue shelter and $200,000 to the pediatric wing of the city hospital. Josh leaned back in his chair and groaned loudly. $350,000 gone before we even get to the real money. Unbelievable. The old man was losing his mind. Richard did not argue with him. That restraint made Josh's comment sound even uglier. I watched Barbara make a small note on the pad in front of her, as if the charitable gifts were deductions she intended to reverse the moment she gained control. Frank kept tapping one finger against the table, impatient for Richard to reach the asset clause. Across from them, I thought about how Thomas had handled money while he was alive. He had never worshipped it. He treated it as a tool, something that could keep a roof repaired, pay a worker, fairly fund a hospital room, or give a frightened child a stable home. The people waiting to inherit him understood the size of his estate, but none of the values that had built it. I kept that thought to myself. The will was about to say more than I ever could. Richard paused. He slowly turned to the next page. He looked up, his eyes moving past Frank, past Barbara, past Josh, and resting briefly on me. Then he looked back down at the document. Clause 4. Richard read, his voice growing slightly louder and far more deliberate. Regarding my biological brother, Frank Davies. Frank sat up completely straight, a greedy, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He nudged Barbara with his elbow. Here we go. I leave to my brother, Frank Davies, the exact sum of $1, Richard read. The room went dead silent. Nobody breathed. Frank blinked, his smile frozen on his face as his brain struggled to process the words. I am sorry, Frank said, letting out a nervous, confused chuckle. I think I misheard you. Did you say $1 million? I said $1, Richard repeated, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. And I will read the addendum Thomas attached to this clause. It states, I leave Frank $1 so that he cannot claim he was simply forgotten in this document. I leave him nothing else because 18 years ago he drove his 12-year-old daughter to my house, threw 2 garbage bags of her belongings onto my porch and abandoned her like she was nothing. A man who throws away his own child does not deserve a single penny of my legacy. Barbara's mouth dropped open in shock. Her face turned chalk white. Richard continued, his voice relentless. Clause 5. The entirety of my remaining estate, including the primary residence, all commercial real estate holdings, vehicle titles, stock portfolios, and the remaining balance of all liquid assets, totaling approximately $18 million, is left solely and exclusively to my beloved niece, Chloe Davies. She is appointed sole executor of this estate effective immediately. For 3 long seconds, the room was absolutely silent. Then the explosion happened. Barbara let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She pushed herself back from the table so violently that her heavy leather chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. This is a lie, she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass walls. This is a complete lie. You are a fraud. She is a fraud. Frank leaped to his feet, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. He slammed both of his fists down on the cherrywood table so hard the wood groaned. You son of a bitch, Frank roared, pointing a trembling finger at Richard. You forged this. She paid you to forge this document. There is no way my brother left his entire fortune to a pathetic little brat. I am the next of kin. I am the brother. It all belongs to me. Frank lunged around the table, his arms outstretched as if he meant to physically grab the attorney by the throat. Josh jumped up, shouting obscenities, while Brittany stood frozen in absolute shock, her dreams of a Florida summer home completely shattered. Richard Stanton did not back away. He calmly reached under the lip of the conference table and pressed a concealed button. Frank, if you take one more step toward me, I will have the building security tackle you to the floor, and I will press charges for attempted assault. Frank stopped in his tracks, chest-heaving, saliva flying from his lips as he panted. You have not won, he screamed, turning his furious gaze toward me. I sat completely still, watching them fall apart. You hear me, Chloe? You have not won anything. We are going to contest this will. We are going to tie this money up in court for the next 10 years. We are going to destroy your life. I stood up, picked up my briefcase, and looked him directly in the eyes. Good luck with that, Frank, I said softly. The heavy doors opened and 2 large security guards stepped into the room. Richard pointed at my family. Escort these people out of the building immediately. If they resist, call the police. Frank grabbed Barbara by the arm, dragging her toward the door. Josh and Brittany followed, their faces pale and twisted with rage. They stormed out into the hallway, screaming threats and cursing my name, until the elevator doors finally closed behind them. The war, they declared, had just begun, and they were about to find out exactly how prepared I was for their next attack. A heavy pounding on the grand oak doors shattered the quiet of the estate at exactly 8 o'clock the very next morning. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when the noise echoed through the grand foyer. I set my mug down on the kitchen counter and walked purposefully toward the entrance. I knew my parents were not going to simply walk away after being humiliated at the law firm, but I had not expected them to escalate the situation this quickly. I reached out and unlocked the deadbolt. As soon as I pulled the heavy door open, a man in a cheap windbreaker shoved a thick stack of legal documents directly into my chest. "You have been served," he mumbled before turning around and scurrying down the stone steps. Standing on the porch behind him was a man I had never seen before. He wore a tailored navy blue suit that cost more than a reliable used car, a silk tie, and a smug, aggressive smile. Flanking him on either side were 2 uniformed county sheriffs. They stood with their hands resting near their duty belts, looking uncomfortable but strictly professional. And standing at the bottom of the porch steps, trying to stay out of the morning drizzle, were Frank and Barbara. They both wore identical expressions of absolute triumph. "Good morning, Chloe," the man in the suit said, stepping forward so his expensive leather shoes crossed the threshold into the house. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I represent your father, Frank Davies. We are here to enforce an emergency injunction granted by the county judge late last night. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your personal belongings and vacate this property." I did not step back. I looked at the thick stack of papers in my hands, then up at the attorney. "On what grounds?" I asked smoothly. Mr. Sterling puffed out his chest, clearly accustomed to intimidating people with legal jargon. "On the grounds of gross elder abuse, systematic isolation, and extreme undue influence. We have filed a formal contest to the will you produced yesterday. We have sworn affidavits from my client stating that you deliberately kept Thomas Davies away from his loving family during his final months. You restricted his phone calls, you manipulated his medical care, and you coerced a vulnerable, dying man into signing over his entire fortune." Frank stepped up onto the porch, pointing a finger at me. "We know what you did," he barked, his voice loud enough to echo across the front lawn. "You locked him away in this house. You poisoned his mind against us. But you made a mistake. You did not know that Thomas reached out to me before he died." I looked at Frank, my face completely blank. "Is that so?" I asked. Barbara marched up the steps to stand beside her husband. "Yes, that is so," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "Thomas was terrified of you. He knew you were trying to steal everything. He begged Frank to save him." Mr. Sterling reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a clear plastic sleeve. He held it up so I could see it, but he kept it firmly in his own grasp. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling announced, his voice dripping with arrogance, "We are not just contesting the fraudulent will you paraded around yesterday. We are here to execute a superseding document. My client has provided me with a revised property deed signed by Thomas Davies just 3 days before his unfortunate passing. This deed officially and irrevocably transfers the ownership of this estate directly to his brother Frank." One of the sheriffs cleared his throat and stepped forward, tipping his hat slightly. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, his tone apologetic but firm, "the judge signed the emergency order based on that new deed. The property legally belongs to Mr. Davies as of this morning. We are here to keep the peace, but we do have to ask you to step aside and let the rightful owner enter the premises. You will need to gather your things." Frank let out a loud, nasty laugh. He pushed past the sheriff and stood inches from my face. "I told you," Frank whispered, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. "I told you that you were going to lose. You are just a pathetic little girl playing a game you do not understand. Now get out of my house before I have these officers drag you out in handcuffs." Mr. Sterling checked his gold wristwatch. "You have 55 minutes, Chloe. I suggest you start packing." I looked at the forged deed in the plastic sleeve. I looked at the emergency injunction in my hand. Then I looked at the 2 armed sheriffs standing on my porch. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took a deep breath and took a step back, opening the door wider. "Gentlemen," I said, addressing the sheriffs directly, "I understand you are just doing your jobs, but before I pack a single bag, I need you to step inside the foyer for exactly 5 minutes. I have something in the study that you and especially Mr. Sterling need to see immediately. If you still want to remove me after those 5 minutes, I will walk out the door quietly." The sheriffs exchanged a cautious look. The older deputy nodded. "5 minutes, ma'am. Lead the way." "This is ridiculous," Barbara screeched, stomping her foot on the stone porch. "She is stalling. Do not let her go in there. She is probably going to steal the silver." "Let her stall," Frank sneered, walking confidently into the grand foyer and looking around as if he already owned the chandelier. 5 minutes will not change the law. We have the deed." I turned around and walked briskly down the hall to the study. The group followed me, their footsteps loud against the hardwood floors. I walked straight to the massive mahogany desk, reached underneath, and pulled out a heavy fireproof lockbox. I placed it on the center of the desk, entered the combination, and popped the lid open. Inside was a thick manila envelope and a high-end digital tablet. I pulled out the envelope and handed it directly to Mr. Sterling. "I highly recommend you open that, Mr. Sterling. As an officer of the court, you are legally obligated to review all evidence of fraud." Mr. Sterling frowned, his smug expression faltering slightly as he took the envelope. He pulled out a stack of documents clipped together. "What is this?" he demanded. "That is a comprehensive psychiatric and neurological evaluation." I explained clearly, my voice carrying across the quiet room. "It was conducted by 2 independent board-certified physicians, exactly 1 week before my uncle passed away. You will see their signatures, their medical licenses, and their sworn affidavits on the first page. They declare unequivocally that Thomas Davies was of completely sound mind, possessing exceptional cognitive function, and acting under absolutely zero coercion." Mr. Sterling began flipping through the pages, his eyes darting rapidly across the medical jargon. His face began to lose its color. But I did not stop there. I picked up the digital tablet, turned the volume all the way up, and pressed play. I turned the screen so the sheriffs, the lawyer, and my parents could all see it perfectly. The video showed Uncle Thomas sitting behind this exact desk. He looked tired, but his eyes were alert, and his posture was steady. Richard Stanton sat beside him with the final will open to the signature page, and a notary sat on the opposite side of the desk with her seal and journal visible in frame. The recording carried its date stamp across the lower corner. Richard asked Thomas to state his full name, the date, and why he was signing. Thomas answered clearly. He identified me as the sole beneficiary of the remaining estate, confirmed that the decision was his alone, and said no one had threatened, pressured, medicated, or isolated him into making it. Then Richard turned to the signature page. Thomas read the dispositive clause aloud, took the pen in his own hand, and signed the final will while the camera continued recording. The notary verified his identification, watched him sign, entered the act in her journal, and applied her seal. Nothing about the scene looked rushed or confused. Thomas asked for a second sheet to be placed beside the will and looked directly into the camera. "My name is Thomas Arthur Davies," he said through the speakers. "Today is October 14th. I am making this additional statement because I know exactly what my brother Frank may try to do when I die. I have left my estate to Chloe knowingly and voluntarily. I have not signed any new property deed transferring this house to Frank, and I have authorized no last-minute transfer of this estate to him. If a deed appears after my death claiming otherwise, it did not come from me." I paused the video on the frame showing Thomas's signature, Richard's witness page, and the notary's seal. Then I opened the digital file information on the tablet. The date and time matched the notarized execution record in the envelope Mr. Sterling was holding. The psychiatric evaluations had been completed 1 week earlier, and the video documented Thomas signing the final will while fully oriented and speaking for himself. The forged deed in Sterling's sleeve carried a date 3 days before Thomas died. The contradiction was no longer a matter of competing family stories. It was sitting on the desk in front of 2 sheriffs, a lawyer, and the people who had brought the false deed into court. I looked at the attorney. His hands were shaking so violently that the medical papers rattled. The arrogant lawyer who had swaggered onto my porch 5 minutes ago was gone. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine. "Let us look at that revised deed you brought, Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cold and surgical. "The one Frank claimed Thomas signed 3 days before his death. The one you just presented to a judge to get an emergency injunction." Mr. Sterling slowly lowered the plastic sleeve containing the deed. He looked at the date typed at the top of the forged document, then he looked at the medical records in his hand, and finally he looked at Frank. The realization of what had just happened washed over the lawyer's face in a wave of absolute horror. "You lied to me," Mr. Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. Frank swallowed hard, taking a sudden step backward. He held his hands up defensively. "Now wait a minute, Arthur. We can explain this. That video is clearly manipulated. She used artificial intelligence or something to fake that. You cannot trust it. You forged a property deed." Mr. Sterling shouted, his voice echoing off the walls of the study. He threw the plastic sleeve onto the desk as if it were burning his fingers. "You handed me a forged legal document. You made me present a fraudulent deed to a sitting county judge. You committed a felony, Frank, and you used me to do it." Barbara grabbed her husband's arm, her eyes wide with panic. "Do not yell at him. We paid you a $10,000 retainer to get this house. Do your job and get her out of here." Mr. Sterling backed away from them both, shaking his head frantically. He began stuffing the legal papers back into his briefcase with rapid, uncoordinated movements. "I am not doing anything. I am done. I am formally recusing myself as your legal counsel as of this exact second. You are completely out of your minds if you think I am going to lose my license and go to federal prison for a couple of cheap con artists." The older sheriff stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on his duty belt. He looked from the lawyer to the forged deed on the desk, and then fixed a very hard stare on my father. "Sir," the sheriff said, his voice dropping an octave, "did you forge the signature on that document?" Frank began to sweat profusely. Drops of moisture beaded on his forehead. "No, absolutely not. This is a misunderstanding. The lawyer messed up the paperwork. It is all a big misunderstanding." Mr. Sterling snapped his briefcase shut. He did not even look back at my parents. He practically sprinted out of the study, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor in his haste to escape. We heard the front door open and slam shut. He had abandoned them right there in the hallway. The older sheriff turned to me. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges for the forged document right now?" I looked at Frank and Barbara. They were trapped. Their expensive lawyer was gone, their fake deed was exposed, and 2 law enforcement officers were waiting for my command. They looked small, pathetic, and terrified, but I knew that a simple forgery charge would just put them in a holding cell for a few hours until Josh bailed them out. I had much bigger plans for their destruction. "Not today, officer," I said calmly. "I have a team of corporate lawyers handling the estate fraud. We will preserve the deed, provide it to the proper authorities, and let the estate fraud case proceed through the proper channels." The sheriff nodded slowly. He turned back to Frank and Barbara. "You two are trespassing on this property. You have exactly 30 seconds to walk out that front door, or you are both leaving in the back of my cruiser." Frank did not say another word. The arrogant bravado had completely evaporated. He kept his eyes glued to the floor as he turned around and shuffled out of the study. Barbara followed him, her face completely pale, her hands trembling. I walked behind them alongside the sheriffs, watching them retreat down the hallway. They walked out into the pouring rain. Mr. Sterling was already gone, having peeled out of the driveway in his luxury sedan. Frank and Barbara had to walk a quarter of a mile down the private road just to get off the estate grounds. I stood on the porch watching them trudge through the mud, knowing that this failure was only the beginning of their nightmare. My office phone started ringing at exactly 6 in the morning on Monday, and by noon I had lost 3 of my accounting firm's largest corporate clients. I was sitting at my desk in the downtown firm where I was a senior partner. I had spent the weekend finalizing Uncle Thomas's funeral arrangements and securing the estate, completely unaware that a digital wildfire was being set to destroy my livelihood. The first call came from Marcus Henderson, a real estate developer whose accounts I had managed flawlessly for 7 years. He did not even bother with a greeting. He simply asked if the stories were true. When I asked him what stories he was talking about, Marcus read a Facebook post out loud to me. The post claimed I was a sociopathic manipulator who had locked my dying uncle in a basement room, denied him his heart medication, and isolated him from his loving family just so I could brainwash him into signing over his wealth. The post described me as a predator who used my professional accounting knowledge to embezzle money from the elderly. I asked Marcus where he saw this. He told me it was circulating in every local community group business forum and neighborhood watch page in the city. It had thousands of shares. People were leaving reviews on my business page calling me a criminal and demanding that the state board revoke my CPA license. Marcus told me that he could not have a suspected embezzler handling his corporate taxes, and he terminated our contract right then and there. Before I could even process what had just happened, my second line rang. Then my cell phone started vibrating. I opened my internet browser and searched my own name. A cold dread washed over me as the results flooded the screen. My mother Barbara and my sister-in-law Brittany had realized they could not beat me in a court of law, so they had taken their war to the court of public opinion. They had launched a massive coordinated social media smear campaign designed to destroy my career. There were dozens of anonymous accounts posting identical, highly inflammatory paragraphs. But Barbara was not anonymous. She was replying to the anonymous posts using her real name and a profile picture of her pretending to cry. She wrote lengthy, dramatic comments about how her heart was broken, how I had always been a troubled, greedy child, and how she just wanted justice for her poor deceased brother. She thanked the anonymous posters for bringing my dark secrets to light. Brittany had taken it a step further. Under fake usernames, she had uploaded doctored screenshots of text messages that I supposedly sent bragging about stealing the estate. She posted links to my accounting firm's website, urging people to call my boss and demand my termination. The anonymous accounts were relentless, tagging local news stations and police departments, demanding an investigation into my uncle's death. At 1 o'clock, the managing partner of my firm, a strict man named David, walked into my office and closed the door behind him. He looked incredibly stressed. He held a stack of printed emails in his hand. "Chloe," David said, dropping the papers onto my desk. "We have received over 200 angry emails through the company portal this morning. Our Google review rating has dropped from a 5 to a 1 star in the span of 4 hours. People are calling the reception desk and screaming at the secretaries. I know you are dealing with a family dispute over an estate, but this is spilling into the business. It is damaging the reputation of the entire firm." I looked at the printed emails. They were filled with vicious lies, calling me a thief and an elder abuser. "I am sorry, David," I said, keeping my voice level. "These are completely fabricated, defamatory statements manufactured by my estranged parents. They are trying to extort me." "I believe you," David replied gently but firmly. "You are one of the best accountants we have, but the partners had an emergency meeting 10 minutes ago. Until this public relations nightmare is resolved, we need to suspend you with pay. We cannot have you representing the firm while clients are actively pulling their accounts. Pack up your desk and go home." They had done it. In less than 24 hours, Frank and Barbara had managed to torch my professional reputation and get me suspended from the job I had spent a decade building. I packed my briefcase in silence. I walked out of the building with the eyes of my coworkers burning into my back. The humiliation was not abstract. My name was on engagement letters, audit opinions, and years of client work. I had built trust one deadline, one clean reconciliation, and one difficult conversation at a time. Now strangers who had never met me were reducing that record to a handful of fabricated posts. In the elevator, I watched my reflection in the mirrored doors and forced myself not to react to the notifications piling up on my phone. Anger could wait. First, I needed preservation. Every post timestamp, username, attachment, and business review had to be captured before whoever created them realized they had exposed themselves. By the time I reached the parking garage, I had stopped thinking like a daughter under attack and started thinking like an auditor looking at a contaminated file. When I got home to the estate, I did not cry. I did not throw things. I made a pot of strong black coffee, sat down at my laptop, and went to war. If there is one thing an auditor knows how to do, it is follow a paper trail. People think the internet is anonymous, but they are wrong. Every digital action leaves a footprint, and arrogant people always make mistakes. I spent the next 3 hours cataloging every single defamatory post, taking screenshots, and archiving the web addresses. I focused heavily on the anonymous accounts that were doing the most damage. I noticed a distinct pattern. The two most active anonymous accounts, Truth for Thomas and Justice Watcher, were posting long, legally dubious paragraphs during standard business hours. Between 9 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, they were firing off dozens of comments. Then I found their fatal error. One of the anonymous accounts had uploaded a PDF document claiming to be a leaked hospital record showing my uncle was heavily medicated and confused. They had blacked out the names, but they had not scrubbed the file's metadata. I downloaded the PDF and ran it through a basic file property viewer. The digital footprint was right there in plain text. The document had been created by a user named B. Davies, and it logged the IP address of the network where the file was originally generated. I did not treat one metadata field as conclusive on its own. I preserved the original download, created a read-only copy, recorded the time I obtained it, and compared the posting timestamps against the account's activity. The point was not to make a dramatic accusation. It was to build a chain another professional could review without relying on my interpretation. The same username appeared in the document properties, and the network information led to a corporate block rather than a residential provider. That gave me enough to move carefully to the next step. I copied the IP address and ran it through a public registry database. The network did not belong to a private home or a local coffee shop. The IP address was registered to the corporate headquarters of Apex Financial Services. That was the massive corporate insurance firm where Brittany worked as a senior human resources manager. Brittany was using her company computer on her company network on company time to launch a coordinated cyber harassment campaign against a local business owner. I smiled. It was a cold, dangerous smile. I opened a new document and began to type. I did not write to Brittany. I did not write to my parents. I drafted a formal, heavily documented cease and desist letter directed entirely to the General Counsel and the Vice President of Operations at Apex Financial Services. I informed the company executives that one of their senior managers, Brittany Davies, was actively utilizing their corporate servers and company time to commit tortious interference, defamation, and cyber harassment against me and my accounting firm. I attached the screenshots of the defamatory posts. I attached the metadata report proving the fake documents were created on their network. And finally, I attached a notice stating that if the harassment did not cease immediately, I would name Apex Financial Services as a co-defendant in a massive civil lawsuit for failing to monitor and prevent their employee from using corporate resources to commit a crime. I hit send. Then I sat back and watched the clock. Corporate legal departments do not play games with liability. When a company is threatened with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit because an employee is using their computers to harass someone, they act with terrifying speed. Exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes after I sent the email, the anonymous accounts vanished. Every single post, every fake screenshot, every fabricated story was deleted from the internet. The digital wildfire was snuffed out completely. 10 minutes after that, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Josh's number. I answered it and put it on speakerphone, resting it on my desk. "You ruined her life," Josh screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You vindictive witch, you ruined her life." I leaned forward. "What seems to be the problem, Josh? Do not play dumb with me," he roared. Security just marched Brittany out of her building in front of her entire department. Her boss called her into a glass conference room, took her company badge, and suspended her without pay. They told her she is under investigation for corporate misconduct, and she will probably be fired by Friday. "We have a mortgage to pay. How could you do this to your own family?" I listened to him panic. He sounded exactly like a man who was watching his entire world crumble. "You should ask your wife why she was stupid enough to commit a crime from her office computer," I said smoothly. "I simply provided her employer with a digital audit. If you all wanted to play in the mud, you should have made sure you knew how to cover your tracks." Frank's voice suddenly boomed through the speaker. He must have snatched the phone from Josh. "Listen to me, you arrogant little brat. This is not over. You got lucky today. But we are going to break you. We are going to find a way to take that estate, and when we do, I am going to make sure you end up sleeping on the sidewalk." "Frank." I interrupted, my voice perfectly calm and flat. "You do not seem to understand the position you are in. You shot at me and you missed. Now it is my turn." I hung up the phone. I knew the digital smear campaign was just a desperate distraction. They were running out of money, they were running out of options, and their rage was driving them to make careless mistakes. The war had escalated beyond insults and fake deeds. They were about to become desperate, and desperate people always try to break down the door. The silent alarm connected to my phone buzzed violently against the wood of my nightstand at exactly 2:14 in the morning. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached out in the dark and grabbed my phone, opening the estate's high-definition security application. The system was designed to send a silent alert to the master bedroom before triggering the audible sirens, giving the homeowner a chance to assess the threat. I tapped the screen, bringing up the grid of infrared exterior cameras. 2 dark figures were creeping across the back lawn. They were moving quickly through the heavy rain, their faces obscured by black hoods, carrying heavy canvas duffel bags over their shoulders. I switched the camera view to the rear patio. The figures approached the glass French doors that led directly into Uncle Thomas's study. One of the men pulled a long metal crowbar from his bag and wedged it into the seam of the doorframe. With a sharp, aggressive shove, the locking mechanism snapped. The door swung open, and the two men stepped out of the rain and into the house. They pulled down their hoods as they entered the study, and the night vision camera illuminated their faces perfectly. It was my father Frank and my brother Josh. I did not panic. I simply pressed the direct line button on my phone to the estate security team stationed at the front gatehouse. A man named Carter answered on the first ring. "We have 2 intruders in the West Wing study," I told Carter, keeping my voice low and steady. "They are armed with tools. Send the local police a priority break-in call, and then bring 2 of your men to the second-floor landing. Do not trigger the house sirens. I want to catch them in the act." "Understood," Carter replied, his tone strictly professional. "We are moving right now." I slipped out of bed, pulled on a heavy robe, and tied it tightly around my waist. I walked quietly down the carpeted hallway to the grand staircase. I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of metal clinking against wood echoing up from the first floor. Frank and Josh were not just looking for loose valuables. They were looking for the safe Frank had demanded access to on Tuesday. I met Carter and another massive security guard named Lewis at the top of the stairs. They were both holding heavy-duty tactical flashlights. We descended the staircase in complete silence, our footsteps masked by the thick Persian runners. As we approached the closed door of the study, the distinct high-pitched whine of a power drill started up. It was a loud, grinding noise as metal chewed through metal. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the study door. I pushed it open swiftly and reached for the wall switch, flooding the massive room with blinding overhead light. Frank and Josh froze instantly. They were huddled behind the heavy oak desk. Josh was holding a massive industrial power drill with a specialized titanium bit, pressing it directly into the locking dial of Uncle Thomas's wall safe. Frank was holding a crowbar and a canvas bag, his clothes completely soaked from the rain. "Drop the drill!" Carter commanded in a booming voice, stepping into the room and blinding them both with the beam of his tactical flashlight. "Drop the drill right now and put your hands on your heads." Josh gasped, his eyes wide with absolute terror. The heavy power drill slipped from his trembling hands and crashed onto the hardwood floor, gouging the polished surface. He immediately threw his hands up in the air, pressing his back against the wall. Frank, however, gripped the crowbar tighter, his face contorting into a mask of pure panic and rage. "Put the crowbar down, Frank," I said, stepping past the security guards and looking directly at my father. "The police are already on their way. If you swing that piece of metal, these men will put you on the floor, and you will add assault to your felony burglary charges." Frank looked at the 2 massive guards, then at me. He dropped the crowbar. It hit the floor with a loud clang. "What are you doing awake?" Frank stammered, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. "This is my brother's house. I came to get what belongs to me. You have no right to keep me out of here." "You broke in through a locked door at 2 in the morning with a crowbar and a drill," I replied smoothly. "You are wearing dark clothes and carrying empty duffel bags. You are not a guest, Frank. You are a common thief. Dad, tell them to let us go." Josh pleaded, his voice cracking hysterically. "You said the alarm was disabled. You said she would not hear us. If my boss finds out I get arrested, I will lose my job. Tell them we made a mistake." Frank spun around and glared at his son. "Shut up, Josh. Do not say another word. They cannot prove we were going to take anything. We were just looking for documents." I pointed up at the corner of the ceiling where the small red light of the security camera was blinking steadily. "Every second of this has been recorded in high-definition audio and video," I informed them. "Including the part where you destroyed the locking mechanism of a wall safe you have no legal right to open." The wail of police sirens pierced the night, growing rapidly louder as multiple cruisers sped up the private driveway. Red and blue lights began flashing through the large windows of the study, illuminating the rain-soaked glass. Josh dropped to his knees, covering his face with his hands, sobbing loudly. "I am sorry, Chloe," he cried. "Dad made me do it. He said we needed the cash inside the safe to pay for a new lawyer. He said it was our only chance. Please do not let them arrest me. Brittany will divorce me if I go to jail." "You are a pathetic coward," Frank spat at Josh, his face turning purple with disgust. "Stand up and act like a man." 4 local police officers rushed into the room, their hands resting on their holsters. Carter briefed them quickly, pointing to the broken French doors, the dropped tools, and the damaged safe. The officers did not hesitate. They grabbed Frank, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the oak desk, pulling his arms behind his back. The sharp click of metal handcuffs echoed through the room. A second pair of officers hauled a crying Josh to his feet and cuffed him just as quickly. "You are going to regret this," Frank screamed as the officers dragged him toward the front door. "You hear me, Chloe? I am your father. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You are a monster." I watched the officers force them out of the house and into the back of the waiting patrol cars. The heavy rain quickly washed away the mud from their boots on the patio stones. The police took my statement, collected the drill and the crowbar as evidence, and promised to send a detective in the morning. By 3:30, the house was completely quiet again. Carter offered to stay in the hallway, but I dismissed him, telling him to return to the gatehouse. I stood alone in the study, looking at the damage. The front plate of the wall safe was heavily mangled. Josh had managed to drill completely through the dial mechanism before we interrupted him. The door was slightly ajar, the internal locking pins shattered by the torque of the bit. I walked over to the safe, grabbed the edge of the thick steel door, and pulled. It groaned loudly, the metal grinding against itself, before swinging wide open. Inside the safe was neatly organized. There were stacks of municipal bonds, several velvet jewelry boxes containing Uncle Thomas's vintage watch collection, and neat bundles of cash wrapped in bank bands. Frank and Josh had been mere seconds away from stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable assets. I began removing the items, carefully placing them in the fireproof lockbox on the desk. As I cleared out the bottom shelf, my hand brushed against something strange. The floor of the safe felt uneven. I pressed down on the metal panel, and it gave way slightly with a soft click. It was a false bottom. I lifted the heavy steel plate. Hidden in the shallow cavity beneath was a single tarnished brass lockbox. It had no combination dial, just a small keyhole. I immediately went to the top drawer of the oak desk, where Uncle Thomas kept his spare keys on a heavy ring. I found a small brass key that matched the patina of the lockbox. I slid the key into the lock, turned it, and popped the lid open. Inside the box were no bonds, no cash, and no jewelry. There was only a stack of sensitive financial documents rubber-banded together and a letter written in Uncle Thomas's unmistakable handwriting. The letter was dated 18 years ago, exactly 2 weeks after my parents had abandoned me on his porch. I unfolded it under the bright overhead lights. "Chloe," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have finally reached the documents I kept hidden for you. I am deliberately leaving them sealed in this safe until after my death, because Frank concealed the account from you, and I do not want him to destroy the proof before you are old enough and safe enough to use it. Your grandmother created a trust for you. Frank and Barbara drained it. Their theft, not your braces, was the real reason they abandoned you. Keep this letter with the bank records. It records why you could not reasonably have discovered the fraud while they still controlled your home, your mail, and your financial information." My hands began to tremble, but I kept reading. Thomas had not merely saved statements. He had preserved the discovery trail. The first document was the certified trust agreement bearing the seal of a national bank and the signature of my maternal grandmother, Eleanor. It showed that when I was 12, I became the beneficiary of a $250,000 trust. Because I was still a minor, Frank was named custodian with authority to manage the account for my benefit until I reached the release age. That authority did not make the money his. Every page used the same phrase for the benefit of Chloe Davies. The next pages were transaction records. The withdrawals began almost immediately. $30,000 left first, then $50,000. Other transfers followed through accounts Frank controlled, and through the business Josh was trying to keep alive. I traced each debit with my finger, one line at a time, until the pattern became impossible to dismiss. My parents had treated a child's inheritance as emergency capital for the life they wanted to live. The final statement was dated the same period they were complaining about my braces and preparing to leave me with Thomas. The account balance was zero. 4 days before they drove me away, Frank had authorized the last $40,000 transfer. By the time my clothes were packed into 2 black garbage bags, the entire $250,000 was gone. That sequence changed the meaning of every memory I had carried for 18 years. The golf argument had been camouflage. The speeches about sacrifice had been camouflage. They had already emptied the account, and abandoning me severed the daily relationship, most likely to expose what they had done. I had spent my childhood believing I had been discarded because I cost too much. The papers in my hands showed something colder. They had taken what belonged to me, then removed me from their lives when I became the person most likely to ask where it went. I stood in the study, holding the documents that proved my entire childhood trauma was not the result of my parents being poor or overwhelmed. It was a calculated criminal cover-up. The shock did not turn into tears. It burned away, leaving behind a cold, absolute fury. I carefully placed the documents back into the brass lockbox. Frank and Barbara had just broken into my house because they were desperate for money. They had absolutely no idea that in trying to steal my uncle's wealth, they had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy their entire lives. I booted up my dual-monitor workstation in the study before the sun even began to rise. The police had taken my father and brother away, and the estate was perfectly quiet again, but I was wide awake and operating on pure adrenaline. I spread the 18-year-old bank statements across the massive mahogany desk and opened a blank, highly encrypted financial spreadsheet. It was time to go on the offensive. If Frank thought he could hide $250,000 from a senior forensic auditor, he was vastly underestimating my capabilities. I started the forensic audit by isolating the specific routing numbers from the final wire transfers out of my grandmother's trust account. Frank had not simply withdrawn the cash in one lump sum. He had attempted to layer the transactions in a desperate bid to confuse anyone who might look into the banking history later. The first major transfer of $50,000 went into a regional credit union under the name Davies Enterprise Holdings. I logged into the public state registry databases and pulled the corporate filings for that exact business name. It took me less than 20 minutes to find the original incorporation documents. Frank had registered Davies Enterprise Holdings as a limited liability company 20 years ago. The listed business address was a cheap post office box in a strip mall, and the sole managing member was Frank Davies. He had used this fake shell company to funnel the first chunks of my inheritance, masking the stolen funds as legitimate consulting revenue for a business that did not actually exist. I kept digging deeper into the digital archives. As the pale morning light finally began to filter through the broken French doors of the study, my spreadsheet grew longer and more detailed. I tracked the subsequent wire transfers. After the money sat in the shell company account. For a few months, Frank initiated a complex series of cashier's checks. He moved the money in specific increments of $8,000 and $9,000 to deliberately avoid triggering federal banking reporting requirements. He was structuring the deposits, funneling the laundered cash directly into a joint personal checking account he shared with my mother, Barbara. But it was the final $40,000 transfer, the one executed just 4 days before they abandoned me, that tied the entire criminal operation together. Frank had become arrogant and sloppy. He did not bother layering that final transaction. He wired the massive sum directly from the trust account to an escrow account managed by a local title insurance agency. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, I picked up my cell phone and called a professional contact of mine who worked in commercial real estate underwriting. I gave him the specific name of the title company and the exact date of the escrow transfer, asking him to pull the historical public property records for my parents' current residential address. 30 minutes later, my computer chimed with an incoming email. My contact had sent me the original closing documents for the 4,000-square-foot luxury suburban home where Frank and Barbara currently lived. I printed the heavy stack of closing documents and laid them side by side next to the trust ledgers. The dates matched perfectly. The deposit amounts matched perfectly. I built a source and use schedule on the screen, separating what I could prove from what I only suspected. On the left were the trust withdrawals. On the right were the shell company deposits, cashier's checks, and escrow credits. I refused to round numbers or fill gaps with assumptions. Every arrow in the spreadsheet needed a document behind it. When a transfer passed through an intermediate account, I marked the date, amount, routing number, and destination before moving to the next line. The discipline mattered because anger was not evidence. By the time I finished, the path from my trust to the home purchase could be followed without a speech from me at all. A judge could start at the first withdrawal move through Frank's controlled entities and arrive at the closing statement using nothing but the documents themselves. Frank and Barbara had not just stolen my money to pay off trivial credit card debts or fund my brother's failed car detailing business. They had systematically drained my grandmother's trust during the period leading up to my abandonment, feeding the stolen money into the down payment for their dream home. They had illegally used my inheritance to secure a premium mortgage rate and buy a massive property they could never have afforded on their own mediocre salaries. And the very moment the final check cleared the title company, they packed my childhood belongings into garbage bags and dumped me at Uncle Thomas's estate, effectively discarding the only living witness to their massive financial crimes. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and looked at the mountain of undeniable evidence. My parents were currently sitting in a county holding cell for breaking and entering, but that was just a minor criminal charge compared to what I held in my hands. What I had just uncovered was a massive, multi-layered financial fraud. And because they had used the stolen funds to purchase real estate, I knew exactly how to make them pay for every single tear I shed as a child. At 9 o'clock sharp, I gathered the banking ledgers, the corporate registry printouts, and the property closing documents into a thick leather binder and drove directly to the downtown offices of Harrison & Associates. Robert Harrison was the most aggressive civil litigation attorney in the entire city. He did not handle basic estate law or family disputes. He handled vicious corporate warfare and ruthless asset recovery. I sat in his plush corner office and walked him through the forensic audit step by step. I showed him exactly how Frank breached his legal fiduciary duty as the custodian of the trust, how he layered the stolen funds through a fake shell company, and how he and Barbara used the stolen $250,000 to purchase their current luxury home. Robert examined the paperwork carefully, running his finger down the columns of my spreadsheet. When he finally looked up from the binder, he was smiling a very sharp, dangerous smile. "This is absolutely ironclad," Chloe Roberts said, tapping the binder with his expensive metal pen. "They left a massive, undeniable paper trail, because you were a minor when the fraud initially occurred, and because you only discovered the theft this morning, thanks to your uncle's hidden lockbox. The legal statute of limitations has not expired. We are going to sue them for the original $250,000. But we are also going to sue them for 18 years of compound interest, massive punitive damages for the gross breach of fiduciary duty, and all related legal fees." I nodded, feeling a cold sense of satisfaction wash over me. "What is the total estimated financial judgment?" I asked him. Robert punched a complex series of numbers into his desktop financial calculator. "Assuming a standard market return rate over 18 long years, combined with treble damages for the explicit financial fraud, we will be seeking a court judgment in the neighborhood of $1.2 million. It will completely and permanently bankrupt them. But we need to make sure they do not try to hide their assets, now that they know you are coming after them." "That is exactly what I want to prevent," I told him firmly. "Can we freeze the house today?" Robert immediately picked up his desk phone. "I am going to file an emergency civil complaint before lunch. Along with it, I will file a lis pendens directly with the county recorder's office. It is a formal public notice of pending litigation involving the real estate property. It will place an immediate hard lien on their house. They will not be able to sell it, they will not be able to refinance it, and they will not be able to borrow a single dime against the equity until this $1 million lawsuit is entirely resolved." By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the property lien was officially recorded with the county clerk. While I was meticulously securing the financial trap, Frank and Barbara were walking blindly straight into it. Frank had managed to arrange a temporary release for himself early in the afternoon by calling in a massive favor from a shady bail bondsman, but Josh was facing very serious felony burglary charges, and the judge had set his bond at a staggering $100,000. Frank and Barbara needed $10,000 in cash immediately just to get their golden child out of a miserable county jail cell. They did not have that kind of liquidity in their checking accounts. Their only option was to borrow heavily against the massive equity in their luxury home. At 3:30, Frank and Barbara sat nervously in the quiet office of a senior loan officer at their local community bank branch. "We need a home equity line of credit processed and approved immediately," Frank told the loan officer, trying desperately to sound authoritative despite the dark circles under his panicked eyes and his wrinkled, rain-soaked clothes. "We have over $500,000 in equity on the property. I want to pull out $50,000 today in a certified cashier's check." The loan officer, a polite young man in a crisp shirt, typed rapidly on his keyboard. Of course, Mr. Davies. Let me just run a standard preliminary title check on the property to ensure there are no legal encumbrances before we begin the formal underwriting process. It will only take a moment. Barbara wrung her hands together anxiously. Please hurry. Our son is in a very difficult legal situation, and we absolutely need those funds before the courthouse closes at 5 o'clock today. The loan officer stared intently at his computer screen. He frowned deeply, clicked his computer mouse a few times, and then leaned much closer to the monitor. The color slowly drained from his face. He looked nervously over the top of his monitor at my parents. I am very sorry, Mr. Davies, the loan officer said, his voice dropping to a tense whisper. I cannot process any loans against this property. In fact, my system will not allow me to authorize any financial transactions involving this specific residential address at all. Frank slammed his hand down hard on the desk. What do you mean you cannot process it? My credit score is excellent. The house is worth an absolute fortune. Stop playing bureaucratic games and give me the loan application form right now. Sir, the loan officer replied slowly, turning the computer monitor around so Frank could clearly see the bright red warning banner flashing across the banking screen. A massive civil lien was placed on your property at 2 o'clock this afternoon by the corporate law firm of Harrison & Associates. It is firmly attached to a pending lawsuit for $1.2 million, citing major financial fraud and embezzlement. Your property assets are completely frozen by direct order of the county court. Barbara let out a high-pitched, horrifying gasp, clutching her designer purse tightly to her chest. $1 million. That is impossible. We do not owe anyone $1 million. Who on earth is suing us? The loan officer read the plaintiff line on the screen. The lawsuit was filed on behalf of a Miss Chloe Davies. Frank stared blankly at the screen, his mouth opening and closing in silent shock. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket with violently shaking hands and dialed my number right there in the middle of the bank branch. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen island drinking a fresh cup of coffee when my phone suddenly rang. I saw his name flashing on the screen and answered on the second ring. "Hello, Frank," I said calmly. "What did you do?" he screamed into the phone, his voice echoing so loudly that the bank security guard started walking directly toward the loan officer's glass door. "What kind of fake legal paperwork did you file now? Release the hold on my house immediately. Josh is sitting in a jail cell and I need to pay his bail today." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. I did not file fake paperwork, Frank. I found the brass lockbox hidden inside Uncle Thomas's safe. I found the original trust documents from Grandmother Eleanor, and I spent my entire morning tracing exactly how you used my stolen $250,000 to pay for the house you are currently trying to borrow against. The line went completely dead silent. Only the sound of Frank's heavy, panicked breathing came through the speaker. I could hear Barbara sobbing hysterically in the background. "You stole my entire future to buy your luxury home," I continued, my voice perfectly cold and hard as steel. "And now I am taking it back. I am taking it all back with 18 years of compound interest. You cannot sell the house or borrow against its equity while that lien is in place, Frank. The property is now tied to the case you created, and you cannot use it as your private source of cash." I hung up the phone. I knew they were standing in that bank office completely out of legal options, out of money, and out of time. The trap had permanently snapped shut, and their entire comfortable life was about to be ripped away. My cell phone vibrated against the granite kitchen island exactly 3 hours after my conversation with Frank. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar local number. I answered it, expecting another angry outburst from my father, but the voice on the other end was high-pitched, trembling, and completely stripped of its usual arrogance. "Chloe, please do not hang up the phone," Brittany begged, her breath catching in her throat. "I need to talk to you right now. It is an absolute emergency." I leaned against the counter and set my coffee mug down. "I am listening, Brittany. Make it fast." She let out a ragged sob. "Everything is falling apart." Frank and Barbara came back from the bank empty-handed. They told us about the lawsuit and the property lien. They cannot get the money to pay Josh's bail. He is sitting in a maximum security county lockup right now facing felony charges, and he is terrified. "My company fired me this morning because of the email you sent. I have lost my career, my reputation, and now my husband is going to federal prison." I listened to her cry, feeling absolutely no sympathy. "Actions have consequences," I told her flatly. You tried to destroy my professional life to steal an estate that did not belong to you. Josh broke into my house with power tools in the middle of the night. You are both getting exactly what you asked for." Brittany sniffled loudly. "I know," she pleaded. "I know we were wrong. Frank manipulated us. He told us Thomas owed him that money. He told us you were the one stealing from the family. But I know the truth now. I know what they did to your trust fund when you were 12. I narrowed my eyes, standing up straight. "How do you know about that?" "Because Frank and Barbara are tearing each other apart in their living room right now," Brittany explained quickly. "They are screaming about the money they took from your grandmother. They are completely panicked. But I can help you, Chloe. I can guarantee you win your lawsuit." "I already won my lawsuit," I reminded her. "The paper trail is ironclad. I do not need your help. You need physical witnesses to prove Frank acted with malicious intent." Brittany argued, her voice growing desperate and frantic. "If I testify against him in civil court, I can tell the judge exactly what they admitted to today. I can tell the judge that Frank planned to hide the assets. I can hand you every single text message and email Frank sent Josh about raiding the estate. I will give you everything you need to lock them away for good." I remained silent, waiting for the catch. "And what do you want in return for this sudden burst of honesty?" I asked. "Drop the burglary charges against Josh." Brittany said, the words rushing out of her mouth. "Call the police and tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them Frank forced Josh to break into the house. If you drop the charges against my husband, I will destroy your parents on the witness stand. I swear it to you. Just let Josh come home." I looked out the large kitchen window at the sprawling green lawn of the estate. I thought about the sheer entitlement radiating through the phone. Brittany genuinely believed she could negotiate her way out of a felony by throwing her in-laws under the bus. She thought justice was just a transaction. "Accountability is not negotiable," I told her, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. "What?" Brittany gasped. "Chloe, please, you have to do this. We will lose our house. Josh will lose his job." "Josh made his choice when he picked up a crowbar and shattered my glass doors," I replied evenly. "You made your choice when you used your corporate computer to post malicious lies about my business. You do not get to walk away clean just because you are losing the game. I am not dropping a single charge. Josh will face a judge and he will face a jury. If you want to save yourself, I suggest you find a very good defense attorney." Brittany fell silent for 5 long seconds. When she finally spoke again, her voice had completely changed. The desperate pleading was gone, replaced by a toxic, vicious rage. "You are going to regret this," Brittany hissed through her teeth. "You think you are so smart. You think you hold all the cards. If you will not help me, then I have nothing left to lose. And if I am going down, I am making sure Frank goes down in flames today." She ended the call abruptly. I set my phone down on the counter, perfectly calm. I knew exactly what a cornered animal looked like, and Brittany was completely backed into a corner. I went back to my study to continue organizing the estate files, fully aware that the explosion she promised was only a matter of time. I did not call Frank to warn him, and I did not call Josh to bargain. Brittany had offered testimony as currency, and I had refused to buy it. That mattered to me more than the information she claimed to possess. If she chose to tell the truth now, she would do it because the lies had stopped protecting her, not because I had traded away accountability for her husband. I wrote a brief note for Robert documenting the call while the wording was still fresh in my mind, saved it with the estate litigation file, and returned to the same work I had been doing before the phone rang. I did not have to wait long to see the results of her revenge. At 4:15 that afternoon, my computer chimed with a new email notification. It was forwarded to my inbox from an unknown address, but the subject line immediately caught my attention. It read, "Notice of fraudulent activity regarding Frank Davies." I opened the email and began to read. Brittany had not lied when she said she had nothing left to lose. In a fit of pure vindictive fury, she had bypassed the legal system entirely and gone straight for the throat of Frank's professional life. Frank ran a commercial logistics consulting firm alongside 2 senior partners, Michael and David. The firm managed massive shipping contracts and handled millions of dollars in client funds. They relied entirely on a reputation of absolute financial integrity. Brittany had compiled a massive detailed email exposing everything. She attached copies of the forensic audit she had somehow photographed while Frank was looking at the lawsuit papers. She detailed exactly how Frank had embezzled $250,000 from his own daughter's trust fund. She explicitly outlined his current civil lawsuit for fraud, and she attached a copy of the county public record showing the multi-million-dollar lien placed on his residential property. But Brittany did not just send this email to me. She sent it directly to Michael and David Frank's senior business partners. She carbon copied the firm's primary corporate accounting department. She even copied the firm's external compliance officers. Brittany had effectively thrown a live grenade into the center of Frank's boardroom. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. I received a phone call from my lawyer, Robert Harrison, at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning. Robert sounded incredibly energized. Chloe Roberts said eagerly, "The situation just escalated in a massive way. I just received a frantic phone call from the corporate counsel representing your father's consulting firm." "What happened?" I asked, pulling out a legal pad and a pen. "His business partners received a very disturbing email dump yesterday afternoon," Robert explained. "When they saw the documented proof of his prior embezzlement and the active $1 million civil lien against his personal assets, they panicked. In the financial sector, having a senior partner exposed for federal trust fraud is a death sentence for a firm. They called an emergency board meeting last night. They voted unanimously to sever all professional ties with Frank immediately. They locked him out of his corporate email, canceled his building access, and formally removed him from all company bank accounts." I smiled, writing the details down on my notepad. "So he is officially unemployed. It is much worse than that." Robert continued, a hint of genuine awe in his voice. "Frank's firm recently took out a $3 million commercial expansion loan from a major regional bank. When a commercial loan of that size is underwritten, the bank includes strict moral hazard and financial stability covenants. The moment the business partners ousted Frank for fraud, they were legally obligated to notify the bank of the material change in leadership." "What did the bank do?" I asked. "They triggered the default clause," Robert said flatly. "The bank immediately called in the primary commercial loans due to extreme fraud exposure. They demanded payment in full. Now here is where your father made his fatal mistake. When Frank signed those commercial loan documents 2 years ago, he signed a personal guarantee to secure a lower interest rate. He used his luxury home as collateral to back the business debt." I stopped writing. I stared at the legal pad, processing the massive financial domino effect that Brittany had just set into motion. "Because we filed our civil lawsuit and placed the lis pendens lien on his property. First," Robert explained carefully, "we are technically the first priority creditor, but the commercial bank is not going to wait around for our civil trial to finish. They want their money right now. And since Frank has no job, no access to company funds, and no practical access to new credit against the house, he has no realistic liquidity to cover the loan call. So what happens to the house?" I asked, my heart beating steadily. Robert let out a sharp laugh. "The commercial bank attorneys filed the paperwork an hour ago. They are foreclosing on the property." At 12:30 that afternoon, the same man in the cheap windbreaker who had served me the forged emergency injunction earlier in the week walked up the paved driveway of Frank's luxury suburban home. I knew this because Robert had sent a private investigator to monitor the property and ensure the legal documents were properly delivered. The investigator sent me a live text message update. Frank opened his front door, looking completely disheveled. The process server handed him a thick stack of papers bearing the seal of the commercial banking institution. It was a formal notice of accelerated foreclosure. The foreclosure papers stated that the bank was accelerating the personally guaranteed debt and proceeding against the house Frank had pledged as collateral. Whatever arguments he intended to make later, the immediate result was clear in the notice. Robert showed me the property was in foreclosure and the clock to vacate had started. Frank and Barbara were legally ordered to vacate the premises entirely. They had exactly 30 days to pack up their belongings, surrender the keys, and leave the massive luxury home they had purchased with my stolen future. If they remained on the property past the 30th day, the county sheriff's department would arrive to physically evict them and place their personal possessions on the curb. They had lost the estate. They had lost their son to the criminal justice system. They had lost their jobs and their professional reputations. And now they were officially losing the roof over their heads. I set my phone down on the desk, feeling a deep, profound sense of justice settling into my bones. The countdown clock had officially started, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. 4 days after the bank began foreclosure proceedings on their house, my cell phone rang at exactly 10 in the morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing the final estate tax filings when I saw Barbara's name flash across the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it would be another screaming match or a string of vicious insults. But something made me answer. I pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear without saying a word. "Chloe, please help me." Barbara gasped, her voice weak and wet with tears. I paused, gripping my pen tightly. "What do you want, Barbara?" "I am dying," she sobbed, taking a ragged, agonizing breath that sounded completely genuine. "I am at the hospital. I collapsed this morning in the kitchen. The doctor said I have a massive arterial blockage near my heart. They told Frank I need emergency bypass surgery right now, or I am not going to make it through the weekend." I sat up straight, the pen slipping from my fingers and rolling across the granite counter. A cold wave of shock washed over me. Uncle Thomas had died of a massive heart attack just weeks ago. The terrifying reality of sudden cardiac failure was still fresh and painful in my mind. Despite everything she had done to me, despite the fraud and the abuse, hearing my mother say she was about to die triggered a deep instinctual panic inside my chest. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice losing its usual cold edge. "I am at the West Side Medical Pavilion." Barbara cried, her voice trembling violently. "But Chloe, they will not do the surgery. Frank's business health insurance was canceled when his partners fired him. We have no coverage. The hospital administrator said the out-of-pocket cost for the bypass and the intensive care recovery is over $150,000. They need a massive deposit today before they will take me into the operating room." I stood up, pushing my chair back so hard it scraped against the floor. "You are at an emergency room and they are denying you life-saving care because of a deposit. That is illegal, Barbara. They have to stabilize you." "They did stabilize me," she wept loudly. "But they said the full surgery is considered elective until the heart actually stops." "Chloe, I am so scared. I do not want to die. Frank cannot get a loan because you froze our assets. You have to call your lawyer. Please, just release the lien on the house so Frank can pull the cash out to pay the hospital. You can keep the rest of the lawsuit going, I promise. Just let us save my life." My heart hammered against my ribs. For a fraction of a second, I felt a crushing sense of guilt. I was the one who had frozen their money. I was the one who had backed them into a financial corner. If she died on a hospital bed because she could not access her home equity, that blood would feel like it was on my hands. "Okay," I said, rubbing my forehead with trembling fingers. "Give me the name of your attending cardiologist. I will call the hospital billing department directly and wire the deposit from the estate account. You do not need the house lien released. I will just pay for the surgery myself." There was a sudden sharp silence on the other end of the line. The ragged breathing stopped for just a second. "No," Barbara said quickly, her voice sounding slightly less weak. "No, you do not need to do that. Just release the lien. Frank has all the paperwork ready. It will be much faster if we just use our own money. You do not want to mix estate funds with this." My analytical brain, trained to detect financial inconsistencies, instantly snapped back to attention. The panic in my chest vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating suspicion. A woman dying of a blocked artery does not argue about which bank account pays for her life-saving surgery. The contradiction hurt more because for those few minutes I had believed her. Some part of me, buried under 18 years of distance, had still responded to the word mother before it responded to the word liar. I had already been willing to pay for treatment directly, not because she deserved access to my money, but because I did not want vengeance to turn me into someone who ignored a genuine emergency. Her refusal of direct payment stripped the emotion away from the problem. If the surgery was real, verification would help her. If verification frightened her, then the request was never about surgery. "I need the name of your doctor, Barbara." I repeated, my tone dropping back to a flat, professional level. "If I am going to release $1 million legal lien, I need verbal confirmation of your medical status from the hospital administrator. Who is treating you?" "Dr. Evans," Barbara stammered. "But he is in surgery right now. You cannot talk to him. Chloe, please stop acting like a robot and help your mother." "I will handle it," I told her. I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I did not call my lawyer. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched for the main directory of the West Side Medical Pavilion. I dialed the Central Hospital switchboard. A polite operator answered on the first ring. "Hello," I said smoothly. "I am calling to check on a family member who was just admitted through the emergency room for a cardiac blockage. Her name is Barbara Davies. Could you connect me to her room or her attending nurse?" The operator typed for a few moments. "I am sorry, ma'am, but I do not have a Barbara Davies in our cardiac intensive care unit. I do not have her registered in the emergency department at all today." "Are you absolutely sure?" I pressed. "She told me she is at the West Side Medical Pavilion waiting for surgery. Let me check the outpatient and specialty clinic registry," the operator offered kindly. A few more seconds of typing echoed through the receiver. "Oh, here she is," the operator said cheerfully. "Barbara Davies is registered in the East Wing of the pavilion. She is currently checked in at the Advanced Aesthetics and Rejuvenation Center. Would you like me to transfer you to their front desk?" I stared blankly at my kitchen wall. Advanced Aesthetics. That was not a cardiology unit. That was a high-end cosmetic surgery clinic. "Yes," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. "Please transfer me." The line clicked and a new receptionist answered. "Advanced Aesthetics. How can I help you achieve your beauty goals today?" "Hi," I said. "I am Barbara Davies' daughter. I know she had an appointment this morning. I just wanted to make sure she arrived safely." "Yes, she is right here in our waiting room," the receptionist confirmed brightly. "She is scheduled for a consultation regarding her comprehensive facial lift and neck contouring procedure. She is just filling out her financing paperwork right now." "Thank you," I said. I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her deception. She was not dying. She did not have a blocked artery. She was sitting in a luxury plastic surgery clinic, perfectly healthy, trying to secure financing for a massive cosmetic procedure she had clearly booked months ago. And when she realized her bank accounts were frozen and her credit was destroyed, she decided to call the daughter she had abandoned and fake a terminal illness just to extort the money. I did not call her back. I grabbed my car keys, picked up a thick legal envelope sitting on my desk, and walked out the door. The drive to the West Side Medical Pavilion took 20 minutes. I parked my car in the visitor garage and walked directly into the East Wing. The Advanced Aesthetics Clinic was located on the third floor behind a set of frosted glass doors. I pushed the doors open and stepped into a waiting room that looked more like a luxury spa than a medical facility. Soft, ambient music played through hidden speakers, and the air smelled faintly of lavender. Sitting in a plush white leather chair in the corner of the room was my mother. Barbara was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, sipping cucumber water from a tall glass and aggressively typing on her cell phone. She looked incredibly annoyed, completely devoid of the agonizing pain she had faked on the phone just an hour earlier. I walked across the pristine tile floor, my heels clicking loudly, drawing the attention of the two receptionists behind the marble desk. I stopped right in front of Barbara's chair. "How is the heart blockage, Barbara?" I asked loudly. Barbara jumped, letting out a sharp gasp. The glass of cucumber water slipped from her hand and spilled all over the expensive white leather. She pulled her sunglasses down, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Chloe," she whispered, her face turning pale. "What are you doing here?" "I am here to save your life," I announced, making sure my voice carried across the quiet waiting room. Several other wealthy clients turned their heads to watch us. "You called me crying. You said you were dying. You said you needed $150,000 today, or your heart was going to stop. I just wanted to see the medical miracle that allows a dying woman to sit in a plastic surgery clinic waiting for a facelift." The main receptionist stood up, looking highly alarmed. "Excuse me, is everything all right over there? Do we need to call security?" "Everything is perfectly fine," I told the receptionist with a tight smile. My mother was just explaining how she faked a terminal illness to try and commit financial extortion. Barbara scrambled to her feet, her face flushing an angry mottled red. "Shut your mouth," she hissed, grabbing my arm. "You are making a scene. People are staring at us." I pulled my arm out of her grip violently. "You wanted a scene, Barbara. You called me begging for your life. You tried to use the memory of Uncle Thomas dying to manipulate me into releasing the lien on your house. You are a disgusting, pathetic liar." Barbara completely lost her temper. The facade of the terrified dying mother shattered, revealing the vicious, entitled woman underneath. She stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger right in my face. "You owe me!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. The ambient music could not mask her fury. "You ungrateful little brat! I gave you life. I clothed you. I fed you. I brought you into this world. You owe us everything you have. You think you can just steal our house and ruin our lives because of some old money. You are nothing without us." The entire clinic was completely silent now. The receptionist had picked up the phone, likely dialing building security. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I looked at the woman who had stolen my childhood and my inheritance, and I felt absolutely nothing but pity. "You did not give me a life," I said coldly. "You sold it, and you are about to pay the bill." I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick legal envelope. I shoved it forcefully against her chest. She instinctively grabbed it, looking down at the heavy paper. "What is this?" she demanded, her chest heaving. "That is your formal notice to appear," I explained. "My lawyers finalized the court date this morning. The judge has scheduled the civil trial for the stolen trust funds. You and Frank are going to stand in civil court and explain exactly how you diverted $250,000 that belonged to a minor. Consider us even." Barbara stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. She opened her mouth to scream at me again, but no words came out. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. The fake heart attacks, the forged deeds, the digital smear campaigns, it had all failed. She was completely out of options. I turned my back on her and walked toward the frosted glass doors. "Chloe, wait!" Barbara yelled, her voice cracking with genuine panic this time. "You cannot leave me like this." I pushed the doors open and walked out into the hallway without looking back. I stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the doors slide shut, permanently closing the chapter on the woman who used to be my mother. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B swung open, and the bailiff called the room to order. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to my attorney, Robert Harrison, keeping my back perfectly straight and my hands folded on top of the leather evidence binders. The civil trial was a bench trial, meaning there was no jury. Our entire case rested in the hands of Judge Marcus Sterling, an older, stern-looking man who had spent 30 years handling complex financial litigation. Frank and Barbara sat across the aisle at the defendant's table. They looked completely different from the arrogant couple who had barged into my uncle's estate just a few weeks ago. Frank was wearing a slightly wrinkled beige suit, having clearly lost access to his expensive tailored wardrobe when the bank seized his house. Barbara looked haggard, her posture slumped, her eyes darting nervously around the quiet courtroom. They had hired a discount defense attorney who looked like he had barely read the case file. The defense attorney called Frank to the witness stand first. Frank walked up to the wooden box, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. He sat down and immediately adjusted his tie, leaning back in the chair with a sudden, misplaced surge of confidence. He looked over at me and offered a tight, smug smile. He genuinely believed he was about to win. "Mr. Davies," his defense attorney began shuffling a few loose papers. "Can you explain to the court the nature of the trust fund in question?" Frank cleared his throat loudly. "Yes, I can. My mother-in-law left a small fund for my daughter, but as her legal guardian I was given full custodial discretion. Raising a child is very expensive. My business was struggling at the time and we needed capital to keep a roof over our heads. I made an executive parental decision to reallocate those funds for the overall survival of our family. It was a tough choice, but it was entirely necessary." The defense attorney nodded slowly. "And when did this reallocation occur, Mr. Davies?" 18 years ago, Frank stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. 18 years ago. I am not denying that I used the money. But the law is the law. The statute of limitations expired years ago. Even if you want to call my parenting a crime, which it was not, she waited far too long to sue. You cannot sue someone for something that happened when the plaintiff was in middle school. Frank looked directly at Judge Sterling, leaning forward on his elbows. "It is a frivolous lawsuit, Your Honor. She is just an angry daughter trying to punish us for old family arguments." Judge Sterling did not smile. He simply made a note on his legal pad and looked over at our table. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said in a deep, gravelly voice, "your witness." Robert stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked over to the witness stand holding a single piece of paper. He did not look angry. He looked like a predator circling a trapped animal. "Mr. Davies," Robert began smoothly, "you just testified that you used the trust funds for the overall survival of your family. You claimed you needed the money to keep a roof over your heads. Is that correct?" "That is exactly correct," Frank answered confidently. Robert handed the piece of paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge and then gave a copy to Frank. "Then can you explain why you wired the final $40,000 of your daughter's trust fund directly to an escrow account at a premium title insurance agency?" Frank swallowed hard. His confident posture stiffened. "We were buying a house. We needed a place to live." Robert took a step closer to the witness stand. "You were buying a 4,000-square-foot luxury home in an exclusive gated community," Robert corrected him, his voice rising slightly to echo off the wood-paneled walls. "A home that was significantly beyond your earning capacity. You did not use the money to survive, Mr. Davies. You used it to upgrade your lifestyle. And you did it by embezzling $250,000 from your 12-year-old daughter who had no idea the trust even existed." "I was the custodian," Frank argued, his face turning a dark shade of red. "I had the legal right to manage the money. And like I said, it was almost 2 decades ago. You missed your window to complain about it." Robert smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor." Frank let out a loud breath of relief and practically jogged back to his seat next to Barbara. He patted her hand, whispering something in her ear. He thought he had successfully used the calendar to escape justice. "The plaintiff calls Chloe Davies to the stand," Robert announced. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the witness box. I took the oath, sat down, and looked directly at Judge Sterling. I did not look at my parents. I was here to present the math, and the math never lied. "Miss Davies," Robert said, handing me the heavy leather evidence binder, "your father believes this case should be dismissed due to the statute of limitations. As a certified public accountant, can you explain to the court exactly when you discovered this financial discrepancy?" I opened the binder to the first tab. "I discovered the total depletion of the trust fund exactly 14 days ago," I stated clearly. The defense attorney immediately jumped to his feet. "Objection. The plaintiff is lying. She was 12 years old when the money ran out. She lived in the house. She had to have known." Judge Sterling slammed his wooden gavel down once. "Overruled. The witness will explain how she made the discovery." I turned the page in the binder. "I was abandoned by my parents when I was 12. I explained, keeping my voice steady and professional. I was dropped off at my uncle's estate, and I never saw Frank or Barbara again until Thomas died. I did not know the trust existed because they had concealed it from me. I discovered the fraud only after the break-in damaged Thomas's wall safe and exposed the hidden lockbox inside it. The box contained the original trust records and Thomas's letter dated 18 years earlier, explaining that he had intentionally preserved the documents where Frank could not destroy them and that I could not reasonably discover the theft, while my parents controlled the account and then removed me from their home." Robert placed the original letter and the preserved bank records into evidence. He also submitted the estate security footage showing when the damaged safe was opened and the lockbox was discovered. The records did not ask the court to accept my memory on faith. They established what had been hidden, why it had been hidden, and when it finally came into my possession. I looked at Frank. The smug smile had completely vanished from his face. He was staring at the plastic evidence bag in the judge's hand, his mouth slightly open. Under the legal doctrine of the discovery rule, Robert continued pacing slowly in front of the bench. The statute of limitations for financial fraud does not begin until the victim actually discovers the crime or reasonably should have discovered it. Because my client was a minor when the funds were stolen, and because her legal guardians deliberately concealed the theft by abandoning her, the limitations period did not begin while the fraud remained deliberately concealed from a minor who had no access to the account. The discovery evidence places her claim within the permitted period, Your Honor. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, rubbing his forehead. He had absolutely no counter-argument for the video evidence. I spent the next hour on the witness stand, methodically taking the court through the forensic audit. I pointed out every single bank transfer. I explained how Frank had set up a fake shell company called Davies Enterprise Holdings to launder the first $50,000. I showed the judge the exact routing numbers, proving the stolen money was used to pay the escrow deposit on their luxury home. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let my emotions show. I delivered the evidence with surgical precision. Robert did not rush the exhibits. For each transfer, he asked me to identify the source account, the destination, and the document that connected the two. When the defense suggested the payments might have been legitimate family expenses, we returned to the trust language requiring the money to be held for my benefit. When they suggested the home purchase had somehow benefited me, the closing records showed that my name was nowhere on the deed, the mortgage, or the title. Frank and Barbara alone received the property interest. By the time we reached the final $40,000 transfer, the pattern no longer depended on adjectives like greedy or cruel. The numbers established the benefit, the control, and the concealment on their own. I could see the judge marking exhibit numbers in the margin of his notes, moving back and forth between the trust agreement and the closing statement, before writing one final line and underlining it twice. When I finally stepped down from the stand and returned to my seat, the courtroom was dead silent. Frank was sweating through his cheap suit. Barbara was staring at the floor, her hands trembling violently in her lap. Judge Sterling closed the heavy leather binder and folded his hands on top of it. He looked down at my parents for a very long time. The silence stretched on thick and suffocating before the judge finally leaned forward to speak. Mr. Davies, Judge Sterling, began, his voice laced with a deep, unmistakable disgust. In my 30 years on the bench, I have presided over hundreds of cases involving corporate embezzlement, Ponzi schemes, and massive financial fraud. But I have rarely encountered a case of fiduciary breach as morally bankrupt and deliberately malicious as the one sitting in front of me today. Frank tried to open his mouth to speak, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "You were entrusted with the financial security of your own daughter," the judge continued, his tone rising in volume. "Instead of protecting her, you treated her inheritance as a personal slush fund. You systematically laundered the money through a fictitious corporate entity. You used it to purchase real estate for your own personal enrichment. And when the money ran dry, instead of facing the consequences, you discarded the child like a piece of broken furniture to cover your tracks. Your defense today relied on the cowardly hope that enough time had passed for the court to look the other way. You were wrong." Barbara let out a loud, pathetic whimper, burying her face in her hands. "I find entirely in favor of the plaintiff," Judge Sterling announced, his voice echoing powerfully through the room. "The paper trail is undeniable. Mr. Davies, you completely violated your fiduciary duty as a custodial guardian. Therefore, I am not just ordering the restitution of the original $250,000. The judge picked up his pen and began writing on the official court order. "The judgment will include restitution of the stolen principal, the applicable compound interest for the 18 years in which Chloe was deprived of those funds, and enhanced damages for the egregious breach of fiduciary duty and deliberate concealment," the judge stated. Taking those components together, including the treble damages remedy the court is applying to the fraudulent conduct, you and your wife are ordered to pay Chloe a total civil judgment of $1.2 million. The number was not presented as a rough multiplication on a calculator. It was the court's final award based on the damage categories before it, and it matched the amount fixed in the order the judge signed at the bench. Frank collapsed backward into his chair. His eyes rolled up toward the ceiling as if he were about to pass out. $1 million. He did not have a job. He did not have a house. He had absolutely nothing left to sell. They were officially and permanently bankrupt. But the judge was not finished. And finally, Judge Sterling added, looking over his reading glasses directly at Frank, "You testified under oath today that you funneled these trust funds into a business entity and used them to purchase a primary residence. I highly doubt you declared that stolen $250,000 as taxable income 18 years ago." Frank's head snapped forward. His face turned completely white. "I am forwarding the complete transcript of today's proceedings, along with the forensic audit of your shell company, directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service," the judge declared. "I suspect they will be very interested in discussing federal tax evasion with you. This court is adjourned." The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with a sharp, deafening crack. He stood up and walked out of the courtroom through his private door. Barbara erupted into hysterical, screaming sobs. She grabbed Frank's arm, shaking him violently, begging him to fix it. But Frank could not speak. He just stared blankly at the empty witness stand, paralyzed by the absolute destruction of his entire life. He was not just broke. He was going to face the federal government, and the IRS does not negotiate when it comes to deliberate tax fraud. I stood up from the plaintiff's table and picked up my briefcase. Robert patted my shoulder, offering a genuine, victorious smile. "We did it, Chloe," he whispered. "We took everything." I looked across the aisle at the two people who had thrown me away. I watched them drown in the consequences of their own greed. I did not feel any pity. I did not feel any sadness. I just felt completely, wonderfully free. I turned my back on them and walked out of the courtroom, leaving them to their ruin. I signed the final incorporation document for the Thomas Davies Youth Scholarship Foundation and placed my pen down on the mahogany desk. The heavy grandfather clock in the corner of the study struck midnight, its deep chimes barely audible over the sound of the torrential rain battering the estate windows. I had spent the last 3 weeks untangling the legal mess my parents left behind, and tonight was the first time the house felt truly peaceful. I gathered the files, placing them into a neat stack. I was finally using my uncle's wealth to help teenagers who had been abandoned by their families, ensuring no child in this city would ever be thrown away the way I was. The sharp, sudden blare of the security intercom shattered the quiet of the study. I frowned, looking at the glowing panel on the wall. It was past midnight on a Friday, and the storm outside was causing severe flash flooding across the county. No one was scheduled to be at the estate. I walked over to the panel and pressed the camera activation button for the main gate. The high-definition screen flickered on, showing the wrought iron gate standing tall against the driving rain. There was no car in the driveway. Instead, 2 figures were standing on the pedestrian side of the gate, pressing their fingers against the call button. I zoomed the camera in. The streetlights above the gate illuminated them perfectly. It was Frank and Barbara. They were completely soaked, their hair plastered to their faces, shivering violently in the cold downpour. But it was not their ruined clothes or their terrified expressions that made me freeze. It was what they were holding. Frank was clutching a heavy black plastic trash bag in his left hand. Barbara was holding an identical black plastic trash bag in her right hand. The 30-day foreclosure eviction period had officially expired at 5 o'clock this evening. The county sheriffs had forced them out of their luxury home, and they had clearly been unable to afford a moving truck or a storage unit. Their finances had been crushed by the civil judgment, the foreclosure, and the collapse of Frank's business, and whatever cash they had left had clearly not been enough to keep them in their home. They were standing in the rain with the exact same 2 trash bags they had used to pack my life away 18 years ago. The intercom buzzed again, a long, desperate sound. I pressed the 2-way radio button. "Who is there?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and unrecognizable through the outdoor speaker. Chloe Frank yelled, his voice cracking and desperate. "Chloe, please answer the gate. It is your father. Open the gate. We had to walk 3 miles from the bus stop. The roads are flooding. Please." I stared at the screen. I did not unlock the gate. Instead, I pressed the button to connect directly to Carter, the head of my private security detail, who was stationed in the gatehouse just a few yards away from where my parents were standing. "Carter," I said quietly into the receiver. "Yes, Miss Davies," Carter responded immediately. "I see them on the monitors. Should I contact the local police and have them removed for trespassing?" "No," I replied, my eyes fixed on the screen. "Open the pedestrian gate. Let them walk up the driveway to the front porch. I will meet them at the door." "Understood," Carter said. I watched the screen as the heavy iron pedestrian gate clicked, unlocked, and swung open. Frank and Barbara stumbled through, dragging their black plastic trash bags behind them. They began the long, agonizing walk up the quarter-mile driveway. The wind was howling, pushing the rain sideways, and they struggled to keep their balance. I left the study and walked slowly through the quiet, warm hallways of the estate. I turned on the exterior porch lights, flooding the massive stone entrance with bright, unforgiving illumination. I stood in the grand foyer and waited. Several minutes passed before I heard the heavy, exhausted footsteps dragging across the stone steps. Frank raised his fist and pounded weakly on the heavy oak door. I reached out, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. The freezing wind immediately whipped into the foyer, bringing the smell of wet pavement and damp clothes. Frank and Barbara stood on the welcome mat, completely broken. Frank's cheap suit was ruined, clinging to his shivering frame. Barbara's makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks, and her shoes were completely caked in thick brown mud. They dropped their trash bags onto the porch. The plastic tore slightly, revealing a jumbled mess of cheap clothing and toiletries inside. Chloe Frank gasped, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Thank God you let us in. We did not know where else to go." The sheriffs locked the doors. They changed the locks while we were still standing in the driveway. "We have no money. Our credit cards are declining. The hotels will not take us." I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. I did not step aside. I looked at the trash bags resting on the stone porch, and then I looked directly into Frank's eyes. "Why are you here, Frank? I asked, my voice carrying no warmth, no anger, and no invitation. Barbara pushed past Frank, reaching her trembling, freezing hands out toward me. "Because you are our daughter," she sobbed, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "You are our family. We have nowhere to sleep tonight. The shelters are completely full because of the storm. We are freezing, Chloe. We are starving. Please just let us come inside, just for one night. We will sleep on the floor in the basement. We do not care. Just let us out of the rain." I looked at her hands reaching for me. I remembered reaching for her when I was 12 years old, crying in the back seat of their luxury sedan, begging them not to leave me. I remembered the taillights of their car disappearing down this exact driveway. "You cannot come inside," I told them, my voice steady and resolute. Frank staggered forward, grabbing the heavy brass doorframe to keep himself from collapsing. "You cannot mean that," he pleaded, his arrogant pride completely obliterated. "You cannot just leave us on the porch. We are your parents. You won the lawsuit. The bank took the house. The judgment took what little room we had left. Everything is gone. We have nothing left. You proved your point, Chloe. You won. Now please have some mercy on us. You cannot leave us on the street. We will die out here." I stepped out onto the covered porch, crossing my arms over my chest to block the chill of the wind. I stood between them and the warmth of the house. "Mercy," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue as if it were a foreign concept. "You want mercy. Where was your mercy 18 years ago, Frank? Where was your mercy when you drained my grandmother's trust fund to buy your luxury house? Where was your mercy when you drove me to this exact same porch, dropped 2 garbage bags at my feet, and drove away without even looking back?" "We made a mistake," Barbara wailed, falling to her knees on the hard stone. She gripped the hem of my pants, sobbing hysterically into the fabric. "We were stupid. We were greedy. We know we were wrong. But we are still your parents. You cannot do this to your own blood. God will punish you if you leave your parents to die in the street." I reached down, took a firm hold of her wrists, and peeled her freezing hands off my clothes. I stepped back, forcing her to kneel in the puddles of rain accumulating on the porch. "You stopped being my parents the day you chose a luxury house over my safety," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the sound of the thunder. "You stopped being my parents the day you decided my braces were too expensive, but your country club membership was essential. You stopped being my parents the day you forged documents to steal my uncle's estate, and the day you tried to frame me for elder abuse, and the day you faked a terminal illness to extort me. For years I thought the cruelest thing you did was leave me here. I was wrong. The cruelest thing was teaching a 12-year-old child to believe she had caused it. I spent years wondering whether I had asked for too much needed, too much cost, too much. The trust records answered that question. I was never the financial problem. I was the person whose money you wanted and whose questions you feared. Thomas gave me a home, but he also gave me enough distance to learn that love does not arrive with an invoice, and family does not become family by repeating the word blood whenever consequences appear." Frank shook his head wildly, tears streaming down his face. "We were desperate. We were just trying to survive. We did not know what else to do. Please, Chloe, I am begging you as your father. Do not do this. Do not become like me. Be better than me." "I am better than you," I replied coldly. "I am a successful accountant. I own this estate free and clear. I am opening a charity foundation to help children who were discarded by parasites like you. I built a beautiful, secure life entirely without you. But being better than you does not mean I have to be your savior." Barbara looked up at me from the ground, her face twisted in absolute agony. "What are we supposed to do?" she cried. "Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at the torn black plastic trash bags resting on the stone. "I suggest you pick up your bags and start walking," I told her. "The public bus stop is 3 miles down the main road. If you walk fast, you might catch the early morning route." "Chloe, please," Frank screamed, falling to his knees right next to Barbara. He reached out to grab my shoes, but I stepped backward, crossing the threshold back into the grand foyer. "No, no, you cannot close the door. You cannot do this." I placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the oak door. I looked at the two of them, kneeling in the rain, broken, bankrupt, and completely defeated. They were finally experiencing the exact terror, the exact isolation, and the exact heartbreak they had inflicted on a 12-year-old girl 18 years ago. The universe had perfectly balanced the books. "I do not owe you anything," I said quietly, "and my debt is officially paid in full." I pushed the heavy oak door shut. The thick wood completely silenced their screaming. I engaged the heavy steel deadbolt with a loud final click, leaving them outside in the freezing storm, surrounded by the ruins of their own choices. 6 months later, my private investigator, a retired police detective named Mr. Miller, slid a thick manila envelope across the polished mahogany desk in my study. He took a sip of his coffee and leaned back in the heavy leather chair, crossing his arms with a satisfied nod. I opened the envelope and spread the glossy 8x10 photographs across the wood surface, officially closing the final chapter on the Davies family. "We wrapped up the asset tracking this morning, Chloe," Mr. Miller said, pointing to the first photograph in the stack. "The Internal Revenue Service finished their audit last week. Because Frank completely failed to declare the $250,000 he stole from your trust fund, and because he tried to hide it in that fake shell company, the federal government seized absolutely everything they had left. The IRS emptied their remaining checking accounts, seized their retirement funds, and auctioned off both of their vehicles to cover the back taxes and federal penalties." I looked at the photograph. It showed Frank wearing a bright orange uniform vest, pushing a heavy line of metal shopping carts across an asphalt parking lot. He looked exhausted, his face deeply lined, his shoulders stooped under the hot afternoon sun. "He is working at a discount hardware store on the industrial side of town," Mr. Miller explained, tapping the picture. "He makes minimum wage sweeping the aisles and loading bags of mulch into the back of pickup trucks. And because you hold a $1.2 million civil judgment against him, the state automatically garnishes 25% of his weekly paycheck before he even sees a dime of it." I moved the picture aside and looked at the next one. It showed Barbara walking out of a fast food restaurant wearing a hideous brown polyester uniform and a hairnet. She was carrying a mop bucket toward a back dumpster. "She got hired at that roadside diner near the interstate." Mr. Miller continued, a hint of grim amusement in his voice. "She cleans the grease traps and scrubs the public restrooms on the night shift. They are renting a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex right next to a noisy freight train crossing. They do not have a car, so they both have to ride the public bus for 2 hours every single day just to get to their minimum wage jobs. They are living on absolute pennies, Chloe." I nodded slowly, studying the image of the woman who used to wear designer sunglasses and demand room service. She had spent my entire childhood treating me like a financial burden. She had faked a terminal illness to extort me for cash. Now she was scrubbing floors just to afford groceries. "What about Josh?" I asked, moving to the final photograph. "Josh took a plea deal on the felony burglary charges," Mr. Miller replied. "His public defender told him he would serve 5 years in a state penitentiary if he went to trial, considering we had him on high-definition security cameras with a power drill in his hands. He pled guilty to breaking and entering and destruction of property. The judge gave him 5 years of heavily supervised probation, 400 hours of community service, and a strict curfew." I looked at the picture of my older brother. He was standing behind the checkout register of a local supermarket, wearing a green apron bagging groceries, while a customer yelled at him over a bruised apple. "Brittany did not stick around to support him," Mr. Miller added, finishing his coffee and standing up from his chair. "The moment the commercial bank foreclosed on the house and Josh caught his felony charge, she packed her bags and filed for a highly contested divorce. She blamed him and your parents for completely destroying her career at the financial firm. She moved 2 states away, leaving Josh with all of his mounting legal debts. He is living on an air mattress in Frank and Barbara's tiny living room. They spend every night screaming at each other, blaming one another for the fact that their entire lives are ruined." "Thank you for your excellent work, Mr. Miller," I said, gathering the photographs and sliding them back into the envelope. "I will have the final invoice paid by the end of the day." Mr. Miller tipped his head respectfully, shook my hand, and walked out of the study. I walked over to the paper shredder sitting in the corner of the room. I did not need to keep the photographs. I did not need to dwell on their misery or gloat over their absolute ruin. I fed the thick envelope into the machine, watching the sharp steel blades shred the images of my family into tiny, unrecognizable strips of paper. The universe had delivered the exact punishment they earned, and I was finally free to move forward. I walked out of the study and stepped into the grand foyer of the estate. The house did not feel empty or quiet anymore. It was a bright Saturday morning, and the property was absolutely alive with energy. I had spent the last 6 months transforming Uncle Thomas's massive legacy into something that would actually change the world. The heavy oak front doors were pinned wide open, letting the warm morning sunlight and the fresh breeze spill across the marble floors. A professional catering team was setting up long tables covered in crisp white linen on the back patio, arranging trays of fresh food and cold drinks. But the most beautiful sight was the group of young people walking across the front lawn. Today was the official opening orientation for the Thomas Davies Youth Scholarship Foundation. I had legally repurposed the massive estate, turning the sprawling first floor into a comprehensive educational and support center for teenagers who had been abandoned, emancipated, or aged out of the foster care system. I hired top-tier tutors, career counselors, and financial advisors to work in the very rooms where Frank and Barbara had tried to stage their hostile takeover. At the same time, I had stabilized Thomas's commercial holdings and placed them under disciplined professional management instead of liquidating them for a quick payday. The rental income and investment returns gave the foundation a reliable operating base, which meant the scholarships were not a one-time gesture funded by grief. The estate had become a functioning, profitable enterprise whose purpose extended beyond preserving wealth. Each quarter, I reviewed the numbers the same way Thomas had taught me to review anything important, carefully, conservatively, and with a clear understanding of who the decisions were meant to protect. For the first time, the accounts attached to this house were building futures instead of destroying one. I walked out onto the front porch, the same porch where I was discarded 18 years ago, and watched a group of 20 teenagers chatting excitedly as they walked up the driveway. They were carrying new backpacks, wearing clean clothes, and looking at the grand estate with wide, hopeful eyes. They had all been told by someone in their lives that they were unwanted, that they were too expensive, or that they did not matter. But today, they were stepping into a place that was built entirely for their success. I greeted them at the door, shaking their hands and welcoming them inside. I introduced them to the counseling staff and showed them the massive library we had built in the West Wing. I watched them sit down at the tables, laughing and eating together, realizing for the first time that they had a safe place to land. Later that afternoon, after the orientation sessions were finished and the students were relaxing on the back lawn, I walked back into my study and closed the door. The afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows across the mahogany desk. I walked over to the bookshelf and picked up a silver-framed photograph of Uncle Thomas. He was smiling warmly, standing in front of this very house. I ran my finger over the edge of the cool metal frame. He had saved my life when I was a terrified, heartbroken 12-year-old girl. He had given me a home, an education, and a foundation of unconditional love. He knew exactly what my parents were capable of, and he had meticulously arranged the pieces I needed to protect myself when he was gone. I looked at his smiling face and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle deep into my chest. The war was officially over. The accounts were permanently balanced. I had taken the worst pain of my childhood and forged it into a shield for others. What mattered most was that the house no longer felt like evidence in a family war. The study was still the study. The porch was still the porch. But the meaning of those rooms had changed because of what happened inside them now. Teenagers met counselors where my parents had once demanded access to a safe. Scholarship applications were reviewed at the table where I had traced stolen money. The front doors that once closed behind a frightened child now opened every week for young people who needed someone to take them seriously. I could not rewrite the 12-year-old version of myself out of the past, and I no longer wanted to. She was the reason I understood exactly what a safe place could mean. Setting boundaries isn't betrayal, it's survival. You do not owe toxic people your future just because they share your DNA. If you've ever had to walk away from toxic family to protect your peace, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today and what time it is there. Remember, you write your